The cold winter wind cut through the quiet evening street like a knife, carrying the faint smell of smoke and snow through the air. People hurried past the small row of restaurants with their coats wrapped tightly around them, eager to escape the freezing night. But near the corner of the sidewalk, beside a dim streetlight that flickered weakly, a man sat alone on the pavement. His hands trembled from the cold. His clothes were thin, worn, and covered in dust, and his tired eyes stared at the ground as if he had forgotten what hope looked like. In front of him sat an empty paper cup with only a few coins inside. Most people passed without even glancing at him. Some pretended not to see him at all. But one small voice suddenly broke the silence. "Daddy, why is that man sitting on the ground?" The voice belonged to a little girl no older than 7 years old. Her soft pink scarf fluttered in the wind as she looked up at the tall man standing beside her. Her father, the man people in the city knew as Alexander Hayes. A billionaire, a man whose name appeared in newspapers, business magazines, and television interviews. His luxury car was parked just outside the elegant restaurant behind them, and his black coat looked like it cost more than most people earned in a month. Yet at that moment, his daughter wasn't looking at the expensive buildings or the glowing lights of the city. She was looking at the man sitting on the freezing pavement. Alexander followed her gaze. For a second, he said nothing. Men like him were used to seeing scenes like this. In big cities, poverty often hid in the shadows of wealth. It was uncomfortable, yes, but it was also common. Sometimes people fall on hard times, Alexander finally said calmly. The little girl frowned. What does that mean? Alexander hesitated. How do you explain life's cruelty to a child who still believes the world is good? It means, he said slowly, that life can become very difficult for some people. The girl looked back at the man again. The homeless man was staring at his hands, rubbing them together desperately to create warmth. Then the little girl said something unexpected. He looks hungry. Alexander didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched the man carefully. The truth was obvious. The man didn't just look hungry. He looked exhausted, broken, like someone who had fought too many battles and lost every one of them. Daddy, the little girl said again quietly, tugging his sleeve. Yes, can we help him? Alexander sighed softly. Helping strangers was complicated. There were rules, risks, responsibilities. Wealthy people learned quickly that generosity could sometimes bring trouble. But his daughter was looking at him with eyes full of simple innocence. Eyes that had not yet learned how cruel the world could be. What do you want to do? He asked gently. The girl thought for a moment. Then her eyes suddenly brightened. Soup. Alexander blinked. Soup. Yes, she said excitedly. Warm soup. She pointed toward the restaurant behind them. People feel better when they eat warm soup. My teacher says warm food makes people feel safe. Alexander stared at her for a moment. Of all the things she could have suggested, money, clothes, anything, she had chosen something simple. Something human. Daddy, she whispered again, can we bring him warm soup? Alexander looked back at the homeless man sitting under the streetlight. The wind blew harder, and the man's shoulders shook from the cold. Then Alexander did something that surprised even himself. He nodded. All right, he said. The girl's face lit up instantly. Really, really. She clapped her hands happily. Inside the restaurant, the warm golden lights and soft music created a completely different world from the cold street. Outside, waiters moved quietly between tables while wealthy guests enjoyed expensive meals. When Alexander entered with his daughter, several employees immediately recognized him. The manager hurried over nervously. Mr. Hayes, welcome back, but Alexander barely glanced at him. I need 2 bowls of your hottest soup, he said. The manager looked confused. 2, sir. Yes. Within minutes, the soup arrived. Steam rose gently from the bowls, filling the air with the comforting smell of vegetables and spices. The little girl carefully carried one bowl with both hands. Be careful, Alexander said. I will, she replied seriously. They stepped back out into the cold night. The homeless man looked up in surprise as the little girl approached him slowly. For a moment, he looked frightened. Many people had mocked him before. But the girl knelt down beside him and placed the warm bowl gently on the ground. We brought you soup, she said softly. The man stared at it as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Then his eyes moved slowly to the little girl. Why? He asked hoarsely. The girl smiled. Because you looked cold. For a moment, the man didn't move. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the bowl. Warm steam touched his face. And suddenly, his eyes filled with tears. Have you ever experienced kindness when you least expected it? The man whispered something quietly. "Thank you," but as he lifted the spoon to his lips, something strange happened. He looked up again, this time at Alexander. His eyes widened slightly, as if he had just recognized something. Or someone. Alexander noticed the look. The homeless man stared at him for several long seconds. Then he whispered something that made Alexander freeze. "You." His voice trembled. "You're Alexander Hayes." The billionaire's expression changed slightly. "Yes," he said cautiously. The man slowly lowered the spoon. For a moment, the street fell silent. Then the homeless man said something that made the entire moment suddenly feel different. "I used to know your father." Alexander's heart skipped a beat. "My father?" The man nodded slowly. "Yes." He looked down at the warm soup in his hands again. Then back at Alexander. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a painful memory. "Your father once saved my life." Alexander felt a strange chill run down his spine. Because his father had died many years ago. And almost no one alive still remembered the man he used to be. But the homeless stranger sitting in front of him clearly did. The little girl looked between them curiously. "Daddy," she whispered. Alexander didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the man's face. Because suddenly, this simple act of kindness was turning into something far more unexpected. And deep inside, Alexander realized something strange. The night was only just beginning to reveal its secrets. Alexander Hayes stood motionless for a moment, the cold winter air suddenly feeling heavier around him. The man sitting on the pavement held the warm bowl of soup carefully, as if it were something fragile and precious. Steam curled upward into the freezing night, but the man's eyes were no longer on the soup. They were fixed on Alexander. The little girl looked back and forth between them with curiosity. She didn't fully understand why the atmosphere had suddenly changed. "Daddy?" she asked softly. Alexander didn't respond immediately. His mind was racing. "My father died 15 years ago," he said slowly, his voice calm but cautious. "Very few people still remember him." The homeless man nodded. "I remember," he said quietly. Alexander studied him carefully now. Beneath the tangled beard and worn clothing, there was something familiar in the man's eyes. Something buried beneath years of hardship. "Who are you?" Alexander asked. The man lowered his gaze for a moment, as if the answer carried a heavy weight. "My name is Daniel Mercer," he said finally. The name struck Alexander like a sudden echo from the past. Daniel Mercer. For a few seconds, Alexander simply stared. Then memories began to surface. His father's voice, long ago, telling stories about a man who had once stood beside him during the most difficult years of his life. A business partner, a friend, someone who had disappeared suddenly many years earlier. "You worked with my father," Alexander said quietly. Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes." The little girl's eyes widened. "You know my grandpa?" she asked with innocent excitement. Daniel gave her a small, gentle smile. "I did," he said. "Your grandfather was a good man." The wind blew across the street again, rattling the empty cup beside him. Alexander folded his arms. "Then why are you here?" he asked. There was no accusation in his voice, only curiosity and confusion. Daniel looked down at the soup again. For a moment he didn't answer. Then he took a slow breath. "Life doesn't always go the way we expect," he said quietly. The street remained silent except for the distant sound of traffic. Daniel continued. "After your father died, the company changed. New investors came in, decisions were made, people were pushed aside." Alexander listened carefully. He had been young when his father passed away. Too young to understand the complicated business struggles that followed. "I lost everything," Daniel said simply. Not with anger, not with bitterness, just quiet acceptance. Alexander felt something uncomfortable stir inside his chest. "You could have contacted me," he said. Daniel gave a